Welcome back to the, I guess this is post live for the conversation brought to you by Workforce Central Canada on behalf of Workforce Central Canada's partners, MDB Insight, Hayek, and NAWB Incorporated. I'm Ron Painter, and we've got our panel from the previous hour back with us, and we're going to go a little more in detail maybe on some questions or some comments that came in. Kelly, you were watching the comments coming in. I was trying to pick up some of the questions. What seemed to be, I don't want to say one or two, because there were a lot of chat. There were a lot of comments that came in. A lot of great information, by the way, that came in about resources. What were some of the themes that resonated with people?
Well, I think one of the clear things is how many different strands there are to this topic. And I think our panelists did an amazing job of sort of bringing their own flavor to the conversation and some issues that just generated more ideas, which were fantastic. So we have all of those list of wonderful questions and the dialogue that was happening. People were really happy with it. And I think what came out, and I responded on the chat, was these are all great topics for future conversations, to keep the conversation going and to continue to engage people that represent all of our stakeholders. I think one of the things that came up a lot that we could probably continue with everyone is the experiential learning piece. You know, I think how and what does experiential learning and training and what does that all look like at all levels of education? And
yes, Sarah, that's I guess I'll field that to you first. I mean, that's a really interesting, you had mentioned simulation at one point in time. I've been inside some companies. I had a really cool experience at Wichita State University out in Kansas, state of Kansas, where they had us put on the goggles and we shrunk ourselves down and we walked into a jet engine. To look at the schematics and look at the engine. Are we going to see more of that? And how far does that take us to the notion that I agree, Kelly, that I saw over and over? You can't replace that hands-on. How close can we get?
You know, I think, well, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, there's lots of augmented and virtual reality already going on throughout the college system. We've got to recognize the expense related to doing that. We've also got to recognize that that classes learn from each other as much as they can learn, you know, by themselves in goggles. They learn as much from watching what others are doing, and so there's a real tension between, you know, where the resource is going to come from. Is it really the best way to learn? Is it another way of learning? So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to build elements of these things in to round out the learning experience. But I don't believe that any one of these technologies replaces that ability to work in groups and work hands-on. Are the groups smaller? Probably, at least for the time being, they're going to have to be. There's definitely some adaptations that are going to be required. But, you know, we've got to recognize you have a money issue. That's not going away. It is not cheaper to try to train fewer people on more expensive equipment and hope that you end up with a result that is equally high value. And so to me, those are some of the things that I think we've really got to grapple with as a post-secondary system. And more broadly, when we're starting to think about what is it that we need, what skills do we need in our workforce?
Jake, I'm gonna, like, as I see the screen, you're down here, Steven's in the middle, Gladys is over here. So I'm gonna come down to you and I'm gonna say, what is LinkedIn learning about e-learning?
Yeah, if you don't mind, and I've done this a few times already today, Ron, so I apologize. I'm going to jump back to an earlier point and then jump forward to what LinkedIn Learning is doing, because I think for the average listener, what might be equally helpful is some of the debates that have been going on in my head between listening to Sarah and thinking, okay, I'm hearing from a lot of post-secondaries, and I run once a week now a group of, I think it's up to around 50 people who are active in online learning, either as a vice president academic at one college or as the head of teaching and learning at another university or running an ed tech company. And that group of 40 or so individuals has really struggled with exactly what we were struggling with in the past hour and in this hour, which is specifically how much can you move online? How good is it to move as much as possible online? And what are the implications for disadvantaged populations in particular? Because honestly, most post-secondaries right now are pushing back and saying we need to be in person, but they're saying it for two reasons. They're saying it for all of the good reasons that Sarah made, points that Sarah made, which is to say, you actually do learn human skills in person and you need to evaluate those skills in person. And they're also doing it for some of the, I would argue, worse reasons, which are intransigence. The faculty members' own reticence to move online, either because they don't have the digital literacy skills, or as a faculty member at McMaster for 5 years, I don't really like teaching online. And I work for an online learning company. But personally, I prefer that human interaction. And yet schools have to, post-secondaries have to learn how to move online, because that digital literacy is as core to their student success as it is to their faculty members' success. And right now, both in Canada are behind the 8 ball. And if we could take advantage of this opportunity, really across North America and around the world, to leapfrog, to use this opportunity to say, look, we're going to come out of this valuing human even more than we left it, than we entered it, I should say. But we're going to take advantage of this window to learn the digital literacy skills. And then we're going to go back to valuing the expensive human interactions that post-secondaries provide so well.
Yeah, I was struck with earlier in the conversation when you were talking about the skills that are in demand. My brain did a little to-do list is to go back and reread Daniel Pink's A Whole New Mind, because Pink talks about these essentials. Gladys, I'm gonna come over to you and ask. So Sarah has talked about e-learning and technology, and Jake has. Do you worry about the capacity of the youth serving organizations across the country in this new digital world?
Yes.
Like staff capability and their ability to transmit to young people how critical this is going to be?
Career development and employment services is not a tech savvy sector. The work that we do is predicated on one-on-one conversations of getting to understand someone, helping them articulate their interests and their aptitudes in ways that they struggle to do on their own. And being able to do that online and leverage assessments and tests and databases and network platforms and all these different things in order to help them do it still doesn't replace the need to provide direct personalized support for those who are multi-barriered and most vulnerable. And we've had no choice but to figure out how to do that remotely and virtually as a result of the pandemic. So it begs the question, is it impossible? Is it suitable for everyone? And we know that it's not, but we don't have the technology to figure out who it is suitable for. And I think that is our biggest question right now as we start to prepare for a pandemic recovery. How do we assess someone's ability or suitability for online learning, for their ability to participate in remote work, and what is the most suitable thing for them for skill development? Then there's the soft skill development part around how do you develop strong, positive, appropriate work habits in a remote work setting? Because we know that we will have employers who may not bring their teams back into an office and will continue to operate virtual. My organization is one of them, where we started with an office and now we're thinking, why do we need an office? You know, now we've hired someone who lives in Quebec. We've got staff in Toronto. We're a national organization. Do we need everyone sitting in one building at the same time? No.
Yeah, I'm gonna, Trudy, put that into your brain, because I'm gonna come back and ask you how this changes the landscape of cities and towns. But Kelly, I want to get you involved in the conversation, because Gladys has brought up career development. Do you see the recognition kind of growing the career development to Stephen's point earlier, that we need to get better at taking the data and make it actionable around what are the occupations? career development have a higher profile today than it has, or certainly not enough? I'm gonna guess you're gonna say not enough, but tell us where that is today.
It is a great question. It's a really big part of this. I mean, we knew that career development and the career planning process is so important. And embedded in that is labor market information that kids and parents are always looking for as they think about what their future might be like, as they think about what post-secondary education and training and experiences and lifelong learning they might have. They need that information. And right now, all of that information they may have had is going to potentially change. And so I think we will have a real need for young people to be not redirected, but supported in their need to be resilient and to think about their futures differently. And where will they show up in that plan? I mean, when you think about businesses that participate in experiential learning, those experiences are so important and required in many of the courses that people take in post-secondary and beyond. And when you think about skilled trades training, absolutely required. But where will that fit in as we transition into remote work and we transition into virtual work? And how will we have co-op placements? How will we have experiential learning?
I was going to ask you, because
big questions.
You operate a site, right, where I can express interest in either hosting a co-op or getting a co-op or apprenticeship. Are you watching that demand, I don't know about evaporate, but it's probably taken a hit?
Yeah, well, it's really, but it brings the idea of having a career lab to a completely different thinking of it, right? What does that look like? How does that happen? And how does everybody access the kind of information they need from these resources? And I would go back to labor market information, employment supports, training supports, education. That's a lot to navigate. And to not actually physically go to these places and see that in action is a mind shift change.
Stephen, I want to get to you and Trudy and really get talking about the economics of the situation, the whole thing. Stephen, what is it we don't know that I guess you wish we did, or you wish we had a way of knowing what the impact is?
Yeah, I mean, I think to this conversation, because it's not my business to understand really how we should be learning, right? I think what we don't know is what we should be learning. Right? So Jake laid out some foundational skills that I think transcend time and to some extent occupations, but we don't know what the labor market landscape will look like. And we're missing some precision around what we should be training for, right? That gap was there before.
Exactly.
But we were tweaking the margins. This employer can't find this person, labor shortages, not growing as fast. Now the stakes are pretty high.
I was going to ask you, do you think this changes that whole view from the employer about like what I need, what they thought they needed, where they see expansion?
Yeah, and look, I've always felt that what was missing before, which is critical now, is lost in translation, right? Employers are unable to articulate what they really mean by skills. And when I'm a job seeker thinking about what that means, I wouldn't know where to get training on resilience. And for me, that common language between how we can help people, 3 million people who've lost their job in 2 months, many of them who are not on LinkedIn, many of them who don't have access to internet,
Right.
are going to need really concrete support. And people like Sarah can help them out. But we need to know from employers what it is concretely will be needed. And that's not an easy question to answer, because as economists, we often think about single trajectories, right? I hold everything else constant in order to
Yeah.
make some kind of assumption about the future. But
A trend is a trend till it bends, right?
and that leaves us completely unprepared for situations like we're in now. And so, what I really think is needed is like a much more comprehensive perspective on workforce development that includes sector, regional scenarios that are based on quantitative evidence, right? Which is objective, because there's a lot of efforts out there that are lobbying for certain things, which I think are unfounded. But that also has to be kind of grounded, in my mind, in qualitative evidence around what's happening on the ground, right? What are people actually seeing? What are youth feeling? What is it that employer actually needs? Is it just a plastic screen to help protect people? And that needs to happen in a much more comprehensive way where we're all speaking the same language on what it is we should be learning. Then I think we can maybe figure out how we should learn it. But to me, that's the big missing piece.
So as we look at the numbers, and you just released numbers, I believe last week. We'll wait a while. Is it fair for me to ask you? So what are the one or two numbers that you really anticipate seeing, because it gives you a sense of the direction of the market, the labor market?
Yeah, I think the first one will be the extent to which these temporary layoffs translate into rehires or permanent layoffs, right? And that to me is going to signal to us that there's a structural shift, that businesses are permanently closing. They're going to lose that attachment with their employees because they just don't think it's feasible anymore. And to me, that for the moment, the most recent number said 95% of the increase in unemployment in April was due to a temporary layoff.
Okay.
But, we have this legislation in Canada which allows employers to do that without significant or any financial penalty, because then they can bring them back under the same employment conditions as before. And I think when we see that break and we see these temporary layoffs translating into permanent ones, then I think we should be really concerned. And, that's why I think now is not necessarily the time to be talking about recovery, but it is the time to be planning for one.
Trudy, you had talked on the live side about, to Stephen's point, now's the time for planning for recovery. As you think about your work, which crosses all three levels of government, the local, the provincial, and the federal level, if you had your list of well, we need to do 1, 2, 3, which I, having known you for a while, I know you have that list. So what's on your to-do list for those levels of government? And I do have to say, before you answer that, I thought you were spot on. I think Jake's probably heard me tell this story. We were doing a session out in Las Vegas, Nevada, about the future of work. And one of the local elected officials, because in Nevada, they rely on transfer tax. I buy a piece of property, there's a tax on that transfer, and that helps fund local government. Wage taxes help fund schools. And this elected official said, when you automate a plant, robots don't buy houses. They don't buy clothes. They don't go to dinner. So his point was that when we're focusing on the future and on automation, we're not thinking of the impact this is going to have on government. And that comes back to like all kinds of things, education. But what's your list of what should local, provincial, and the federal government be thinking about right now?
So I think I'll break it down. So when I think about it from a local perspective, first and foremost, we need to be making decisions based on what we know. And I don't think we can make assumptions because it's too important to get it right. So we need to understand. So, I mentioned about, BR&E, business expansion and retention. So we need to be talking to our businesses, and we need to be asking the right questions. There's lots of daily, I probably receive, 5, 6, 7 surveys that are being done by, various organizations and groups and municipalities asking questions. Are we asking the right questions? Is the methodology behind the survey a valid methodology? Because if we're not asking the right questions and we're not doing it in the right way, the answers we're getting may not be the right answers that we really need to be focusing on. So I think that's critical. So we need to be talking to businesses. We need to be looking at the impact of these layoffs, that Stephen mentioned, and Ron, that you mentioned. What are, the 3 million jobs that have been lost in Canada? But we haven't talked about the number of job postings that have come out, since the middle of March. There are businesses that are hiring. What are those businesses? What are the sectors? What are the jobs? What are the skills? We need to understand that. So, I think those are two key pieces. I need to reiterate, and I think it was Gladys that did it, and I clapped for her, because for so many years, I've been involved in workforce development for close to 30 years. And I would suggest for 15 to 18 of those 30 years, I had been preaching that we need a national workforce strategy, and we don't have it. We have many provinces and territories in Canada that do not have a provincial strategy. They have pieces of one, but it's not a comprehensive strategy. Ontario has workforce planning boards, 26 of them across the province. No other province or territory in Canada has a workforce planning board that brings together business and education and not-for-profits and government and intermediaries to be having these conversations. So federally, we need a national workforce planning strategy. We need to understand what are the priorities, and collectively, what is the solution that we can be implementing, standardization being one key piece of this. So that if we have talent in one area of the country, that talent has the ability to relocate to another area of the country, either by choice or for employment. We can't necessarily do that right now with a lot of the, certainly not necessarily in the skilled trades unless it's Red Seal, but there's lots of occupations. I think of teachers. A teacher can't necessarily leave one area of the country and come to another because their credentials are not recognized. So it's a loaded question that you've asked, but if I had to summarize, let's get businesses and understand what they need. Let's understand what our labor force is looking like. Let's understand where the demand is, and let's make sure that we're connecting the right people to advance the local strategy that we absolutely 100% need to be developing now. And just to finish off, to Stephen's point, it is about planning. We're not ready. We have multiple projects right now where we need to talk to businesses. Well, we're obviously not reaching out to them because they're not answering the phone. So we need to plan and have a strong plan and have it coordinated and supported both financially as well as through people. And then we need to take those and start implementing them as soon as we get the first sign that it's time to do that.
So I guess I'll ask, this is sort of a Stephen Jake question, however you guys want to answer this. I think, Jake, you brought it up. And as I mentioned earlier, with the ambassador, he brought up, we don't speak enough about a pan North American conversation around skills. How much do you all see that as you look across North America? And then Stephen, I think the question I want to come back and ask you is, how interconnected are we across North America with the states and with Mexico? So I'll turn to you first, Jake. Like, are we more common around the competencies that we're looking for, around the skills that we need, than maybe we think we are?
No, I think we're in trouble. I honestly think Canada's higher education systems do a great job, but if you look at skills as a whole in Canada, we're sort of way under the OECD average, as is the US. And that's largely because of exactly what Sarah was advocating earlier, which is to say lifelong learning. We do a good job of the batch loading upfront piece. We don't do a good job of the distribution across one's career. And our workforce development systems, to Trudy's point, are extremely fragmented, not just based on Canadian federalism, but even within the sub-regional level, and that's true as much in the US as in Canada. So one of the challenges with taking a North American approach to this issue is I think a lot of the best lessons can be learned from Europe and from other places, because North America actually looks pretty similar in this respect, and that's perhaps tied into the piece that I expect Stephen can put some more specific numbers to. But I grew up at our embassy in Washington, D.C. My dad was a diplomat there and eventually our ADM for the Americas. And Canada's economy is so inextricably tied into the US economy. I think it's still, 80% of our trade is with the US. The vast majority of Canada's economy involves the US in one form or another, that what happens in the US happens in Canada, more or less, economically speaking. And in fact, I was actually sort of surprised at Stephen's numbers earlier when he mentioned that there was 3 million Canadians versus 20 million Americans, because that sounded like a slightly higher percentage in Canada than the US. Usually I would have thought they'd track almost exactly. And so I'm wondering, in addition to the other questions you've already asked Stephen, if he has an answer for why that might be the case as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask Stephen earlier, the total in the Canadian labor force, 16 plus million?
Yeah, I mean, I think the labor force is around 20, 22, 23 million these days.
So that's 3 million is a pretty significant shock.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, yeah, the unemployment rate is above 13% now, so it's close to the US, right? Which is now above 14.
Yeah. I think I saw a number the other day. It's edged up over 14, about 14.7%.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're tracking roughly in a similar way, right? I would say, if anything, the US, in thinking about March and April, has been hit harder. They started from a lower point, right? I mean, unemployment rate in the US has bottomed out just above 3% for years now, whereas, we started from roughly 5.7% to go to 13. I suspect, yeah, they'll roughly be about the same. But when I think about workforce development issues, to Jake's point, there's no denying the connection we have to the US, right? I mean, there's always been the economic sort of statement or anecdote that when the US sneezes, Canada gets a cold, which in this particular context actually is not funny anymore, right? When we think about some of the patterns that are happening with respect to the actual crisis, right? But I think one thing that Canada is learning from the US, however, is how we think about and define skills, right? If anything, the US ONET system is probably the one that everyone around the globe actually has been relying on. Perhaps not because it's great, because it's the only one. Now, that's not to say there aren't a lot of things that can be leveraged from the US system, but in my view, what they've actually done in a meaningful way is to try to articulate very specifically what skills are, and which ones are associated with different levels of importance and complexity for each occupation. And we're a little bit behind in that respect, and we're learning from the US and others how to do that. And so I think there is an appetite around North America and the globe to be talking about skills in similar ways, but how they will play out in a country as different as Canada is to the US, I think remains to be seen. But the approach underlying how we go about it, I think, is going to be very similar and not unlike what we've seen in other countries like Australia.
Sarah, I want to ask you. We in the earlier hour, we brought up the fact that a lot of the schools are out. We're homeschooling kids. Is there concern among the polytechnics? We know that when we've got to remediate somebody, the it's a much harder task to get them to completion. Is there concern among the polytechnics about the amount of school that young people who may be rising to post-secondary are missing? Are there are there strategies that you all are thinking about putting in place?
That's interesting, because I think that there's a couple of concerns that I'm hearing, and they're sort of at the both ends of the spectrum. There are the people who were about to graduate and who couldn't complete their coursework and their lab work, and now there's real concern about how do we bring them back onto campus and give them the pieces that we were unable to transition to online delivery, and that is significant in some occupations, probably less so in others. But that we are seeing that there are a number of concerns around both for young people themselves and also from the point of view of the institutions about whether or not we've given them the best start to their careers, and whether or not we actually have to bring kind of people back in. I think that the other end, and the concerns are there too, what does it mean for those high school students that were about to graduate and really were moved so that they're not getting their final exams, they're not doing all of their final projects, they're not doing all of their presentations? What does that mean? Right now, it's early days still, but enrollment for the fall is low. So I think that we're actually seeing people who are in second and subsequent year, they're coming back. The enrollment numbers are right now looking pretty good. Yes, I want to finish what I've started. But when it comes to high school students, I think there's a concern that some high school students will take another go at it. They'll want to go back to high school and finish off. They don't feel confident that they got the skills that they need to be successful in post-secondary. And as a result, we're seeing that first year enrollment, both from a domestic but also an international student perspective, we're seeing that drop off, and that is really concerning. But it does speak to, I think young people are asking themselves, so where do I fit? Do I go back into another degree program? Do I go back into a shorter term graduate certificate kind of situation so I feel confident and there's a place for me in the workforce? And at the same time, I think we're seeing the same thing on the high school end.
So in a way that's counterintuitive though, right? I mean, we have seen that in a downturn, a friend of mine called it sheltering. More young people would head off to post-secondary education because the market's bad. So I'm going to go hang out. I'm going to go shelter at a 2-year or 4-year college. So when you say the enrollments are down, that's kind of counterintuitive, right, to what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it is counterintuitive, and like I say, it's not really clear what that's going to look like in September, and it is possible people are just keeping their powder dry and deciding, okay, I'll decide later when I kind of see what the situation is. But I think that something that we are hearing, students are worried about their safety. And so I don't think we can discount that. Campuses are big places. They've got lots of people, and it's pretty hard to stay apart. And it's not just our students worried about their safety, our parents worried about their safety. And so sheltering is going to take a new, on a bit of a new definition. So funny, I've been talking to government and they say, so what's the international example here? What can we learn? What's going to happen to students if there's no place for them in the labor market? History says they go back to school. But if the schools aren't open, or if they're worried about the quality of the training that they're going to get there, then this is a whole new reality, and we've got to be open to that. We've been talking about resilience and creativity and trying to teach that to our young people. Time to figure out whether we've been drinking our own Kool-Aid, because that we need to be, I think, all generations, all times of our career, we need to be resilient, we need to be creative. And if there was ever a time, it's today.
Yeah, I don't know about the rest of you. I won't speak for any of the rest of you. I went to college and I studied. I went to classes every day and I did my homework, and Stephen, don't laugh at that. but the experience of going to college, in a sense, growing up, is critical. It's something we discount, is it?
I don't think we give it nearly as much. I don't think we give it nearly as much credit as it is for social development, for human skill development. To go back to what Jake was saying, I don't think we give that maybe we don't remember. I know that when I was 20, I was in the middle of a university career, and I loved it because it was as much social as it was about meeting people who cared about the same things I cared about, and learning what I wanted to do and positioning myself for success in the future. But that's what worries me. I think it's what worries my members. It's how do we deliver that experience that they're looking for at the same time as we're trying to deliver the skills they're going to need, and nobody's quite clear yet on what adjustments are going to be required around those skills.
Yeah, I admit now that my mother has passed that I graduated summa cum barely. So yeah, I was one of those students that the whole experience was important. Gladys, so we're talking about young people, emerging workers, and it's really a tough and a transitional period. How critical are community supports or support networks to young people right now?
I think they're incredibly vital, and not for the reasons that you would expect. Not because they are immediately stepping in to help young people reattach to the labor market. They're critical because they're maintaining connection, and they're helping maintain some type of network and some type of community. And for those who sort of oscillate between the employment space and the youth development space, being separated is incredibly difficult. We have so many young people who their community connections are their stabilizing factor, and to be isolated from that at this time is extremely disruptive to their well-being, to the progress that they've made in terms of the things that they want to pursue. So it's really tough. And this is part of the reason why not only do we need to think about how our services need to evolve in terms of the breadth of services that they offer and the manner in which we support workforce development, skill development, employment services. We also need to think about the range of skills that practitioners in this space need to have in order to continue to work with people through this transition period. We're going to come out on the other side of this into something. We don't know what that something is going to be. But as we move through this process, working with clients and job seekers is a different process. You're talking to them not only about what they miss about being at work, what their job prospects look like, but also how they're coping with everything around them. And that includes those who are still working from home and desperately trying to hold on to their job while also managing their household, their family, their children. This is something that is having an extremely adverse impact on women in particular, who, typically, the main, child-bearing parent or the person that's raising their children now need to manage their full-time work schedule and their school-age children who are also at home at the same time. You can't bring anybody into your home to help you with child care. You can't send them anywhere. But you still need to meet your deadlines. You still need to maintain your workload. And it's really, really difficult. And we're really concerned about how far back this is going to set women and particularly young women who are early in their careers.
Ron, I wonder
this now to the group as a whole. I think, Stephen, you pointed out the really vulnerable populations here are women and emerging youth. Jake, you talked about things that the employer needs to learn. I'm going to throw this out to you all. Are we learning things through this that maybe we thought were important, but boy, they're front and center now? I think, Gladys, you mentioned childcare and those kind of things. Are those really now, are we really going to have to rethink?
So in the same way, I mean, I think, Ron, you and I have talked about, I said Satya, the head of Microsoft, described how in the past 2 months, we've undertaken 2 years worth of technological advancement. And I think you responded with another quote that was something like 10 years by Yang, right? And, you know, 10 weeks and 10 years or something. Either way, we're advancing insanely fast. And the things that are changing seem to actually be in line with the changes that were happening before the pandemic in most cases. So as an example, higher education is becoming more elitist. It is harder to access post-secondaries now for all of the populations you just described than it was before, because you have kids to take care of at home, because you have you need technology skills and the actual Wi-Fi and broadband, et cetera, the device, et cetera. So for a whole slew of reasons, we're exacerbating inequality, and that inequality has to be responded to in a smarter manner, because honestly, as much as the government can keep printing and throwing money at these problems, and hopefully there will be a different understanding of debt and a broader understanding of safety nets, et cetera, but irrespective of all of that, we as a workforce development community have to be smarter. And part of that, I think, will be a greater focus on technology. And I don't mean that as somebody who, you know, obviously works for a big tech company and thinks that tech's going to solve all of our problems. Rather, I think tech has done the opposite. I think it's actually exacerbated our problems to date. And so maybe the one area where we need to change is to have the individuals, the organizations, governments, and the private sector supporting women in a more digitally savvy manner that bears in mind the increasing inequality and impacts that are specifically focused on these disadvantaged populations, whether it be women because of childcare or youth because they were raised in a recession, and we know that has a dramatically negative impact on them, or because they were born colored in America, and Blacks have been massively disproportionately affected in America, just as Indigenous likely will be in Canada. And so figuring out how we can leverage a combination of technology and just human empathy to focus more on those populations, because the acceleration has exacerbated these gaps, is sort of, I know, the broad answer that I have. And specifically, if you want a really easy win there, it's not easy, it's just a clear win, it is on digital literacy. Let's focus on getting these populations as digitally literate as possible, because without that, the next time something like this happens, any economic crisis, it's going to negatively impact them more.
Mm-hmm.
At the risk of being accused of being sexist, I really am. I'm gonna turn to Gladys and Kelly and Trudy and Sarah, and I'm gonna ask, do you have a sense of optimism, I guess both community-wide or with employers, that this pandemic has taught companies that they've got to think differently about employee supports, particularly with regard to female employees, to family employees?
So I'm happy to jump in. I would hope so. And I'm not sure that we know the answer to that question yet. You know, one of the things that we've been reading about is she-covery. So, you know, we have to recover, but we also need to she-cover, which is how do we support those, you know, single moms that have been in the workplace, have been CEOs of businesses and companies who have no network of family that they can utilize right now. And they have to make a decision of, what do I do? I either care for my family or I care for my company. Well, obviously they're making the choice of a family first. So I think that's one thing that we need to focus on. But I also think it's important, you know, just to recognize another key area of challenge that businesses need to be focusing on, and that is mental health. Mental health in the workplace has been significantly increasing as a challenge for individuals and for businesses, and how they're managing and supporting people with mental health and wellness. And I think as we start to come out of this, we are going to see significant implications all the way down to our school-age kids. I have a 7-year-old granddaughter, and I see it with her. And so it scares me to think about what those implications are. How are we going to be addressing that? How is that going to impact on the workplace? how responsive are our employers going to be able to adapt what needs to be adapted to support that? So there's just so many questions, I think, Ron, around that whole topic that I don't think that we've even touched the surface of that yet.
Unbelievably, we are coming up to the top of the second hour of really what's, for me, I hope for those who are listening, a fascinating conversation. I want to give you a chance for final thoughts about what you think. Maybe there's something we're doing well to the point about we're seeing trends that have been accelerated. Maybe we were doing something well and we're just not giving ourselves credit for, or kind of what you're looking forward to as we move out of this. Stephen, I'll start with you for closing thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I would start by saying that 12 years of progress was destroyed in 2 months, right? And so I think I can say objectively that what governments across the board have done really well in the past few weeks and months is getting the right support to people who need it the most, right? Now, we can argue that the right systems weren't in place to do that more quickly and more efficiently, but I think the emergency responses have been in the right direction to help those most in need. I think when we think about the recovery, we need to have the same kind of mindset, right? That we're helping those who have been affected most to participate in the recovery so we don't leave them behind. And I think that's something we need to carry forward.
Kelly, closing thoughts.
I think that this follows up nicely and actually speaks to the trend in the conversation on the chat too, is that we have learned that we've not just learned, we have acknowledged, hopefully, we have so much to gain from protecting the vulnerable. And that is vulnerable because you're rural and you have so many issues with connectivity to technology, whether you're outside of the labor market, whether you are young, pre-career, discovery, post-secondary, or coming out of post-secondary and completely unsure of what that means, or whether you're a parent, a single parent, or a female, or a dad or a guardian who's trying to manage the life-work balance, if we can still ever use that term. So I think all of those things come back to the vulnerability and the supports that are needed. And I would say that there's a lot of supports out there. What I would love to see is that our COVID response and our path forward by government and community embraces some of those supports that exist and rolls them into our COVID response, rather than coming up with new ideas and looking at it as a separate issue, but rather bringing forward the things that exist, the things that are working, the things that people may not even know that are out there to help them and to bring hope.
Jake, closing thoughts.
I don't think Jake can hear us.
All right, we'll move. Sarah, closing thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose for me, when I think about what we've done right, I think that there was a rapid response required, and a rapid response was exactly what happened. And that happened across sectors. It happened, across communities. It happened across the country. It happened fast. And I think that, and Canadians rose to that occasion. I think that the challenge next is trying to apply that same sense of let's rise to the occasion and do what needs to be done. It's trying to put that in place and recognize it's going to be a lot harder to go back to full-time work. It'd be a lot harder to put kids back in school or daycare, a lot harder to get employees back into the workplace, a lot harder to get kids back onto campuses than it was to send them home. So we have to recognize that struggle and then move in the direction that we can all say, but we can get this done. We done it before, and you know, we'll rise to the occasion, rise to the challenge again. And I think that that's going to require all hands on deck. But I truly believe that that if I can work from home, anybody can get through a challenge.
Jake, closing thoughts.
Hopefully my internet will bear with me on this one, apologies. But the high level is that we can try to imagine a more humane future, a future where we're actually more focused on all of the things we lost by being forced, to not interact in person with each other. And that we can spend more time right now thinking about that, because I've seen some good writing on it, but I haven't seen a ton of long-term thinking on it. And I think that there is the possibility for us to really reimagine our future for perhaps certainly the first time in my lifetime, and the only time that I can think of us having both the space and the forcing mechanism to do that. And let's take advantage of this moment to imagine a more inclusive future where we work together in much the way that I think Canada's leaders, as Stephen pointed out, have done a fantastic job. I had a family friend who suggested we create a petition just to thank Canada's leaders, apolitical, even outside of government, inside of government. They've responded so well, relatively speaking, across the board, specifically to the crisis, to get the CERB out, et cetera, that it could become a model of collaboration instead of federal fragmentation or federalism, of a variety of other ways outside of government as well, that we can build a better future.
Gladys, closing thoughts.
I would just say I think this was such a great opportunity to talk about what's possible. We know we're facing tremendous challenges. Things look really bleak. The numbers that we got for April did not help, our enthusiasm. But we have tremendous opportunity, and I would really caution us to not lose sight of the opportunity that this chaos presents. The opportunity to collaborate, to better coordinate our services and our ecosystem, and to come in closer and reduce the vulnerability of our own sector. The employment and work development space is an extremely vulnerable space because it is not well organized and coordinated, and we have an opportunity to address that right now. I think what Stephen said about planning to implement recovery efforts now is not the time, and I don't think that we should we should take that for granted, but we absolutely should be maximizing the opportunity to plan and to design and to think through what will be required, how will we position ourselves to be able to respond, and make sure that those who need to be part of that effort are aware of our ability to support. Because I think the sector is ready and willing, but also needs some support to be able to do that well.
Trudy, closing thoughts.
So I completely agree with everything that has just been said. I had some little notes that I jotted down, and you guys touched all of my key points. So, and well said, thank you. I think ultimately, for me, we have an opportunity to really explore how we respond to this from an economic development perspective, because we need all the systems. When I think about, an ecosystem, it touches all of the parts that this group reflects and represents. But first and foremost, and ultimately, jobs and job recovery and employment is grounded in the economic activity of our country. And so having a focus on economic development recovery is what will bring back our businesses, which will bring back our employees, which brings back salaries, which brings back money to spend in our communities, which strengthens our, oh, excuse me, hold that thought.
Rising stronger, you might say, Trudy.
I got excited. So which brings back our economy. And I mean, ultimately, that's what we're all working towards. And so let's start at the local level. Let's build it out from the ground up. Let's get our communities back on track. Let's get our regions. Let's get our provinces. Let's get our country. And then let's look at it, far beyond just the boundaries of Canada.
Trudy Parsons, thank you. Sarah Watts-Reinard, thank you. Stephen Tobin, thank you. Jake Hirsch Allen, thank you. Kelly Hoey, thank you. Gladys Oken, thank you. On behalf of Workforce Central Canada and its partners, MDB Insight, Hayek, and NAWB Incorporated, it's been my pleasure to have you join us for this conversation. I'm Ron Painter. If you have a question or you have something that you want us to talk about, let us know at workforcecentralcanada.ca. Again, ask@workforcecentralcanada.ca. So again, on behalf of all the partners and the panelists, thank you for listening, and hopefully we will join you again soon.